Warning: the following content may be unsuitable for viewers under 18 years of age and those sensitive to fear-inducing or disturbing material. If you are under 18 or easily distressed by frightening content, please stop reading now. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The Woman at the Window. I grew up in the Millbrook Unified School District in upstate New York, a well-funded district where the sports teams had new uniforms every season, the science wing had been recently renovated, and extracurricular programs actually had real budgets behind them. Field trips were embedded in the culture. Not just the boring, shuffle-through-a-museum kind where you scribbled half-hearted answers onto a worksheet and counted the minutes until you could get back on the bus, but real overnight excursions that students genuinely looked forward to. The kind of trips where you went somewhere you wouldn't normally go, stayed in a real hotel or resort, and felt, for 3 days, briefly, like a functioning adult operating in the wider world. I was in concert choir, and our director, Mr. Calloway, organized at least one optional overnight trip per year for the group. Most students went. It was a no-brainer. 3 days away from your parents, a resort paid for by the school's activity budget, and a very relaxed set of expectations from chaperones who were mostly there to ensure nobody got seriously hurt or arrested. I joined choir in 7th grade, and by the time I was a sophomore, I'd already been on 4 of these trips. I thought I understood the rhythm of them, the first night of too much sugar and not enough sleep, the long middle day that somehow manages to be the best, the last morning when everyone packs quietly, and the bus ride home has a different, heavier quality. I thought I knew what to expect. I was wrong. The trip in question was to a place called Ridgecrest Lodge, tucked into the Pocono Mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania. The drive from our school took just over 3 hours, and I spent the whole ride in my window seat next to my best friend Marcus. We'd been close since 6th grade. The kind of friends who develop their own private shorthand over years, who can have an entire argument or a long, elaborate joke using nothing but eye contact and timing, whose parents refer to the other one by first name without needing clarification. We were sharing a room, which upgraded the entire experience from a school field trip to something that felt more like a vacation we happened to have school credit for. We arrived in the early afternoon. Ridgecrest Lodge was larger than I'd expected from the brochure images. Several long, low residential buildings arranged in a loose semicircle around a central lodge structure with a lake visible at the bottom of a gently sloping lawn behind the property. But right away, before we'd even gotten our room keys, the energy of the place registered. The parking lot held maybe 10 or 12 cars. The outdoor pool area was shut down, the deck chairs stacked and wrapped in blue tarp. The grounds staff who crossed the parking lot as we unloaded the bus did so with the particular efficiency of people who'd found a rhythm for the quiet months and were content to keep it. "Dead season," Marcus said, surveying the near-empty lot as we climbed off the bus. That was the right word for it. November in the Poconos falls into a kind of atmospheric limbo, too cold and too late for the leaf-peeping visitors who fill the mountain towns in October, too early for the skiers and winter sports people who wouldn't arrive until the mountain resorts opened in December. Ridgecrest Lodge was operating on minimal everything: minimal staff, minimal activity schedule, minimal guests. But the indoor pool was running, and so was the go-kart track on the far side of the property, the small climbing wall in the recreation building, and the dining hall. For a group of sophomores with no real agenda beyond, spending a few days away from school, it was adequate by a wide margin. We had 4 chaperones, 2 parent volunteers and 2 teachers, but they made it clear early that this was not a moment-by-moment supervision situation. The ground rules were simple. Let a chaperone know your planned activity before you headed out. be present for all 3 meals, and be back in your room by 10 at night. Nobody was shadowing us. We were 15 and 16, trusted to navigate the resort on our own within those parameters. It felt, in the way these things do at that age, like a degree of freedom that almost required celebration. The first full day lived up to everything I'd been anticipating. Marcus and I found Destiny and Kayla, 2 girls from choir who we'd been friendly with since freshman year, and the 4 of us claimed the go-kart track for the morning. Kayla turned out to be terrifyingly competitive, taking corners at speeds that seemed unreasonable for the equipment involved, and Marcus discovered a previously undisclosed fear of heights on the climbing wall in the afternoon, which he acknowledged through expression and grip strength alone, while maintaining a verbal posture of total indifference. We hit the indoor pool before dinner, had a long meal in the dining hall that ran 2 hours because nobody was in a hurry to end it, and returned to the room at 9 with the pleasant, heavy tiredness of a day well used. Our room was 114, ground floor of the easternmost residential building, a 2-story rectangular structure with rooms on both sides of a central corridor. The layout was exactly what you'd expect. 2 full-sized beds, a wall-mounted television, a desk, a bathroom with a shower head that required patience before it produced hot water. Standard resort issue, nothing about it worth noting except one thing. The back of the room had a sliding glass door. It opened onto a small cement pad and a path that ran along the rear of the entire building, and from there the lawn sloped gently downhill for about 100 yards before it met the edge of the lake. In daylight it was pleasant enough, a winter-stripped landscape, bare maples and oaks, the lake flat and colorless under the gray sky. But that first night, with the moon up and the world stripped of activity, the view through the glass was genuinely striking. Full or near full moon, cold air, the surface of the lake, catching the light at an angle that made it look like hammered silver. The kind of scene that belongs in a different story than this one. We left the blinds open. We lay in our separate beds and talked. Marcus's bed was the one closer to the door, maybe 6 feet from the glass. We went back and forth about nothing consequential for what had to be an hour, maybe longer, both of us gradually losing the thread of the conversation as sleep pulled at the edges of it. I was nearly gone when Marcus screamed, not a yelp, not a noise of surprise, a full-throated, completely involuntary scream. The sound a person produces when the body overrides everything else and responds to a stimulus before the brain has assembled any context for it. The sound moved through me before I was conscious of having heard it. I was sitting up before I was fully awake. My heart was running at a pace that made thinking difficult. Marcus was rigid in his bed, both hands gripping the mattress edge, staring at the sliding door. I turned. There was a woman standing on the other side of the glass. She was tall, not within the range of normal height, unusually, noticeably tall, the kind of height that registers before you've consciously processed it. She was thin in the angular, structural way, the way that looks like everything non-essential has been removed. She wore a pale nightgown that seemed to gather and hold the moonlight, giving it a faint luminescence against the dark outside. Her hair was long and silver-gray, loose past her shoulders. Her face was pressed close to the glass, and her hands were splayed flat against it, palms down, fingers spread, the way a person presses against a surface to see through it. She was looking directly into the room, at us. I've described this scene many times since, and I want to be precise about what I saw and what I didn't see. Her expression, as best I could determine in the limited light, was not aggressive. It was not alarmed or distressed. It was something closer to intent, the focused attention of someone engaged in examination. She was looking at us the way you might look at something behind glass in a display case, with that quality of concentrated interest that has no social awareness in it. Then she stepped back, turned without any apparent urgency, and walked to the right and out of the frame of the sliding door. Silence. The distant sound of wind off the lake. Marcus's audible breathing. My own heartbeat. He looked at me. The look was a request for confirmation. Tell me we both saw that. Tell me this is something we agree on. I saw her, I said. I don't know exactly why we went outside rather than doing the obvious thing, locking the door, shutting the blinds, and calling the front desk. Adrenaline produces strange logic. We slid the door open and stepped out onto the cement path, both of us in socks, into the cold November air. Nothing. The path ran empty in both directions under the moonlight. The lawn was undisturbed. No movement toward the lake, no retreating figure visible on the grass or in the tree line. We stood there for a moment in the cold and confirmed to each other what we had seen. Then we went back inside. We left the blinds open. In retrospect, this was probably not the most rational decision, but there was some logic to it. Some half-formed instinct that we'd rather be able to see what was outside than be surprised again by not knowing. Sleep came eventually, but it was the shallow, provisional kind that doesn't really restore anything. Morning diluted the experience somewhat, as mornings do. Breakfasting in the well-lit dining hall surrounded by classmates and chaperones, the whole previous night felt slightly overblown, slightly cinematic. We had an explanation, confused older guest, sleepwalking, any number of benign possibilities, and we deployed it with increasing conviction as the day went on. We didn't tell the chaperones. Telling them risked the trip. We told Destiny and Kayla, who were fascinatedly horrified in the particular way people are when the frightening event happened to someone else, and they're free to enjoy it. The second full day was active and occupied. We hiked around the lake in the morning, used the game room in the central lodge in the afternoon, had dinner, and then went back to the room physically tired in a way that should have produced solid, uncomplicated sleep. We shut the blinds this time. That felt like a reasonable precaution, though neither of us said so directly. Marcus fell asleep before me. I went a while after him. What time? I don't know exactly. Late enough that the resort was quiet and the grounds were dark, and then I was awake. No sound had roused me, no obvious cause, just consciousness arriving without invitation at an unusual hour. That specific quality of being awake at 3 a.m. that feels different from being awake at 11 p.m., a background frequency of wrongness that's hard to put into precise language. The clock on the nightstand read 3:51. I lay still for a moment, listening. The room was quiet. Marcus was asleep. Outside, nothing, and yet the air in the room felt different from how it had felt when I went to sleep. There was a presence quality to it, which I recognize sounds like exactly the kind of thing a person says to make a story better, but I'm trying to describe an actual physical sensation with whatever language comes closest. I whispered Marcus's name. Nothing. I turned my head to look at his bed. Something was in the way. A shape, standing between my bed and his. Tall. Too tall. I looked up, and the woman was there, standing directly beside me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her, looking down at me in the semi-darkness with that same quality of flat, concentrated attention I'd seen through the glass the night before. I couldn't move. Not a conscious choice. My body simply wasn't receiving the instructions. My throat was closed. My limbs were locked. I lay there shaking, which was the only thing happening that I didn't have control over, because the trembling had apparently gotten the memo about adrenaline, even if the rest of me hadn't. She took 2 slow, deliberate steps backward toward the sliding door. Then she said, in a voice that was completely, unsettlingly even, "Your back door was unlocked." Informational, conversational, like she was relaying a minor piece of practical information, like she was doing me a small courtesy by pointing it out. Then she turned, stepped through the sliding door, which she had left slightly ajar, and was gone. The shaking got significantly worse after she left, which strikes me as the backwards way for a body to work. But there it is. I lay in the bed and shook and waited to be able to make myself move. When I could, I turned on every light in the room and woke Marcus and told him what had happened. We locked the sliding door with the deadbolt, a small lever above the handle that neither of us had engaged the night before, wedged the desk chair under the handle, and did not sleep again. It was already close to 4 in the morning. By 7, we were dressed and sitting on the edges of our respective beds. By 8, we were in the dining hall eating fast and saying very little. At 8:30, heading back to the building, we saw her. Room 115, the room adjacent to ours. Also ground floor, also with a sliding glass door. She was visible through the glass from 20 feet away, sitting on the edge of the bed, upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, back straight, face oriented toward the glass, toward the path, toward us. She was completely still in the way that suggests the stillness isn't new, that it has been there for a while and intends to continue. We ran to the central lodge, not to the chaperones first, to the front desk, to the staff. We told them both incidents in overlapping and probably incoherent detail. The staff conferred in low voices and exchanged the kind of uncomfortable looks that indicated this was not a situation they had encountered before and were not certain how to handle. We also collected our teachers, because at this point that felt unavoidable. So it was a group, Marcus and me, 2 teachers, 2 resort employees, who walked back to room 115 and knocked on the door. It swung open. The woman was sitting exactly as we'd seen her through the glass, upright, composed, hands in lap. On the other bed, an older man, neat, gray-haired, collared shirt. He looked up when we entered but said nothing. What followed was a conversation between the staff and the couple that we weren't included in, conducted partly in the room and partly in the hallway. The result, delivered to us apologetically, was that the woman had documented cognitive and behavioral health conditions. The man was her companion. The resort was not legally in a position to remove paying guests without documented grounds for removal. They were sorry for any distress. Our chaperones were not satisfied with this. The argument between the teachers and the resort management was extended, loud in places, and involved at least one phone call to our principal back in New York. Marcus and I sat in the lobby with Destiny and Kayla and waited through all of it. The trip ended that afternoon. Full day early, we loaded the buses, stored our luggage, and drove back to New York in the particular silence that settles over a group when something has resolved, but not in any satisfying direction. Marcus and I didn't talk much on the ride home. We'd both been awake for most of 2 nights, and the relief of leaving was so complete it didn't seem to need words. I've stayed in many hotels and resorts since that trip. Every single time, without exception, I check the lock on the sliding glass door before I go to sleep, the deadbolt and the main lock. And sometimes when the room is dark and it's late, and the only light is whatever comes in at the edges of the curtains, I look at the glass and think about what it feels like to wake up and find someone already in the room, already beside you, already looking down. I think about it more than I'd like. There are a few details I keep returning to when the memory surfaces, and I want to put them down clearly because I think they're the parts that actually matter. The first is the back door. She told me the back door was unlocked. That was the thing she chose to say, in that flat, informational voice, standing in the dark beside my bed at 4 in the morning after having entered through an unlocked door she had identified some time before. The implication of that sequence of events is something I've turned over many times. She hadn't simply wandered in through an unlocked door she happened to try on impulse. She'd known it was unlocked, which means she had tried it before. Possibly during daylight hours, possibly during the previous night, possibly on some other occasion we hadn't registered. She'd been at the door before we were aware of it. She'd noted the lock status. And then she'd acted on that information. I don't know what her intentions were. I don't know what she was doing in the room. The staff's explanation, cognitive and behavioral health conditions, a companion who wasn't apparently managing the situation, accounts for the presence, but not for the sequence of events that led to it. It doesn't account for the fact that she was at our window on the first night, noting which room we were in, and inside our room on the second night, having presumably identified the unlocked access point in the interval. The second detail is Marcus. He had to see her at the window before I did, because his bed was closer to the glass, which means he was awake when she appeared, lying in the dark, not yet asleep, and she came to the window and he saw her and screamed. The image of someone lying in a hotel bed, in a place they've paid to be and are entitled to feel safe in, and looking up from that position of assumed security to find a face pressed against the glass outside, that's the image that has had the longest half-life for me. Not the woman inside the room, the woman at the window, the initial violation of the threshold that we'd maintained as safe. And the third detail is the most mundane, the back door. A sliding glass door in a ground-floor hotel room, and we hadn't engaged the deadbolt. We'd looked at the lake view and enjoyed the moonlight and lay there talking and hadn't locked the door. It's such a small failure of ordinary caution. In any other trip, in any other November, it would have had no consequences at all. Sometimes the only thing separating an unremarkable night from a nightmare is a deadbolt that didn't get turned. Something in the trees. Before I tell you what happened at the nature park, I need to tell you something about who I was at 8 years old. I was a strange kid, not in a troublemaking way. I never acted out, never got sent to the principal's office, never threw anything or started fights. The strangeness was quieter and more persistent than that. I was profoundly, chronically in my own head. My teachers noted it every semester without fail. My mom raised it at every parent-teacher conference. I didn't read social situations the way other kids did. I didn't track where I was supposed to be in relation to where I was. I'd drift away from groups without registering that I was drifting. Follow something? That caught my attention without telling anyone I was following it, surface from my own internal world to find I was somewhere I hadn't meant to be. It was never defiance. It was more like my brain ran on a channel that occasionally got interference from the external world, but always returned to its default frequency. Looking back now, as an adult, I understand that this pattern was well documented. My parents knew about it, my teachers knew about it, my pediatrician had language for it. But understanding a pattern and being able to interrupt it in the moment are two entirely different things, and at 8 years old I had no mechanism for the second. I simply was the way I was. I wandered, I followed, I surfaced to find myself alone, without any clear account of how the transition had happened. I've thought about that day at Millhaven Nature Park more times than I can count. I've thought about it in the particular way that people think about events that could have ended differently. turning it over and over, examining the specific decisions and non-decisions that form the chain, trying to locate the place where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. The chain is short, and each link is perfectly ordinary, and that is the thing about it that I find the hardest to sit with. This is important context for what happened. Our fourth-grade class took a field trip in late October to a place called Millhaven Nature Park, a mid-sized rural attraction about 45 minutes west of our school, somewhere in the flat agricultural landscape outside Columbus, Ohio. I remember the weather that day with specific clarity, the way you remember sensory details from moments that turn out to matter. Low clouds in a color between pewter and ash, a thin, diffuse light that bleached everything slightly, the smell of dead leaves and cold earth, a temperature that hadn't decided whether to produce rain, and so had settled into an ambient threat of it. The park was a combination, a live animal exhibit with native Ohio wildlife in naturalistic enclosures, a walking trail through a restored prairie habitat, and a large indoor nature center housed in a converted dairy barn. We started inside, in the nature center. The exhibits moved through local geology, native plants pressed under glass, a freshwater aquarium with fish I couldn't name, and then, in the back section of the building, a taxidermy gallery. I loved the taxidermy gallery. I want to say this plainly because it explains why my attention locked onto it so completely. The lighting in that section was recessed and directional, creating soft pools of illumination on the glass-fronted display cases. The carpet was a deep, saturated burgundy red that gave the whole space an atmospheric quality it hadn't earned through architecture alone. And the animals themselves, a coyote frozen mid-step, a great horned owl with wings at half spread, a red fox sitting alert, white-tailed deer buck with his neck arched, were preserved with a quality of arrested attention that my 8-year-old mind found genuinely extraordinary. They were suspended at the peak of their alertness. They would never look away. I was absorbed. That particular total absorption that I specialized in at that age, where the brain locks on to something and the rest of the world goes to ambient background noise. 23 other kids and 3 teachers moving through the space around me, and I was looking at a bobcat frozen mid-crouch and thinking about what it had been thinking at the moment it was captured in that position. I don't remember deciding to use the bathroom. I remember noticing the restroom sign at the end of a side corridor, and then I was walking toward it, and then I was inside, and then I was washing my hands at a low sink, and then I was pushing back out through the door into the hallway. The hallway was empty. I could hear voices. The particular acoustic, signature of a group moving through a large, high-ceilinged space. But the sound was bouncing through the converted barn in a way that made directionality unreliable. I couldn't locate them. I'd been in the bathroom for maybe 2 minutes, but 2 minutes is enough time for 23 people to move entirely out of a corridor. I turned left and walked down a hallway I hadn't been through yet, looking for them. The taxidermy displays continued here, mounted at greater height, with full diorama arrangements behind long stretches of plate glass, river otters in a bank scene, a family of white-tailed deer in a meadow with a painted sky behind them. A coyote paused at the edge of a clearing, ears forward, weight distributed as if it had heard something and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. I moved slowly because I was looking at them. I was not focused on finding my class. This is, in retrospect, consistent with a pattern. I saw him at the far end of the corridor. He was standing, behind a stack of folding chairs pushed against the wall, near an emergency exit door. Partially concealed, I could see his legs, his dark jacket, the side of his face where it caught the overhead light. He was a grown man, somewhere in the later portion of his 30s or early 40s, heavy-set, with several days of beard and a gray hooded sweatshirt under the jacket. He was positioned in the specific way of someone who is trying to be less visible than they are, and he was looking down the corridor in my direction. He saw me when I stopped walking. He came out from behind the folding chairs with his hands loose at his sides, moving at a pace designed to register as casual. His expression had that calculated friendliness, not spontaneous, not quite natural, of someone producing an impression for a purpose. He said, "Hey, bud, do you know where your class went?" I said I didn't. "Come on," he said. "I think I know where they headed." He held out his hand. I took it. "I want to hold here for a moment because this is the part I've turned over the most in the years since." The sentence he used, "I think I know where they headed," exists in a specific, recognizable category of adult sentences. It's the sentence teachers use, and camp counselors, and lifeguards and security staff and museum docents, and every adult who has ever collected a separated child and returned them to their group. My brain heard it, matched it to the pattern, and filed the situation in the correct folder without further review. I took his hand and walked with him. He led me back down the corridor, past the exhibit cases, to the emergency exit door. He pushed it open with one shoulder, and we went through. Outside was a service area at the back of the building, a concrete pad, two large dumpsters off to the left, a row of wooden benches along the wall, and a chain-link fence running the length of the property perimeter. On the other side of the fence, about 30 feet back, the tree line started. Dense, mixed forest, eastern hardwoods, bare branches at this point in October, the kind of tree line that closes in the moment you step past it. The emergency door swung shut behind us, and the hand changed. I've searched for a better way to say it and always come back to this. The hand changed. Not the pressure exactly, but the quality. It went from one thing to another thing entirely, and the new thing was mechanical and locked and communicated in the wordless way that physical force communicates, that I was not going to be let go of by accident. He stopped talking. He started moving toward the tree line, and I had to move with him because of how he was holding my arm. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not call out or struggle. What I felt in my body at that moment is difficult to put into words because it wasn't like any fear I'd experienced before. It wasn't the alarmed, jumpy fear of a sudden loud noise or a near miss. It was larger than that and more total. A sensation of absolute free fall inside my own body, like every internal structure had been removed and I was inhabiting empty space. My stomach, my chest, my throat, a feeling so consuming and complete that it crowded out every physical output. I walked because my legs kept sending themselves forward under some automatic process I wasn't directing, and everything else, screaming, crying, pulling away, just didn't happen. We were maybe 15 feet from the first row of trees. Then the woman screamed. From the other side of the chain-link fence, on the far side of the property, a woman's voice at full volume, the kind of scream that produces itself before the brain has assembled a sentence, pure alarm in its most primitive form. Not a word, just sound. Everything else available. It was one of my teachers. He dropped my hand and ran. Not at a jog, at a sprint. Straight into the trees without slowing, without looking back, without a word spoken. The forest swallowed him in seconds. I stood on the concrete pad and looked at the space where he'd been. Then the emergency door behind me hit the wall, and my teacher came through it, and then another adult behind her, and then a third, and then there were hands on my face and my shoulders and a lot of voices. "Are you hurt? Are you okay? Did he hurt you? Stay right here, don't move. We're calling someone." My mother arrived later. The police arrived sooner. Every student was back on the buses before the police had finished their initial questions. The park's management was deeply shaken. I sat in a plastic chair inside the lobby and answered what was asked of me and tried to determine what I was actually feeling, which seemed like a larger question than I had the machinery to answer right then. I sat in my usual seat on the bus for the drive home. Most of the other kids turned around to look at me at some point during the ride, with varying mixtures of concern and fascination. A few of them whispered. One girl asked if I was okay, and I said yes, because it was the simplest available answer. And then, as the bus turned out of the parking lot and began moving down the long gravel access road toward the highway, I looked out my window. He was crouching at the edge of the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the road, partially concealed behind the low branches of a young tree growing at the forest's margin. He was completely still. His face was turned toward the buses, pale in the gray October light, and he was watching us leave with a patience that, in memory, I find the most disturbing element of the entire event. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't moving away. He was watching. I said nothing. I've analyzed this silence many times since. The most generous explanation is that I was 8 years old and badly frightened and operating below any useful level of cognitive function. But there's another possibility I've considered. Something more instinctive, more animal. The sense that the safest response when a predator's attention has been broken is to not re-attract it. Don't call out. Don't point. Let the bus carry you out of range, and don't give it a reason to notice you specifically before you're gone. Whatever it was, I kept quiet, and the bus moved, and the tree line closed behind us, and we went back to ordinary life. A description was filed with the police. My parents took several months to return to their previous comfort level with my being anywhere independently. I saw a school counselor a handful of times, which I found uncomfortable and not particularly useful, though I kept that assessment to myself. The weeks immediately following the incident had a particular quality that I didn't have the vocabulary for at the time and only developed language for much later. I wasn't visibly distressed in the ways that adults seem to be watching for. I didn't have nightmares, at least not that I could remember in the morning. I wasn't crying or refusing to go to school. From the outside, I probably looked like a child who had been startled and was now recovering. What was actually happening was quieter and harder to describe. A recalibration of my understanding of the world that didn't produce visible symptoms because it wasn't processing itself as trauma. It was processing itself as new information. The world contained certain things I hadn't previously known it contained. I was integrating that. I didn't tell anyone about seeing him at the edge of the trees when the bus left. Not the police, not my parents, not the school counselor. I'm not entirely sure why. Part of it was the 8-year-old's limited model of what adults needed to know and what they could act on. Part of it might have been the instinct I described earlier. Don't bring attention to yourself while you're still in range. But part of it, I think, was something more fundamental. By the time I saw him crouching in the brush, watching the buses go, some protective mechanism had sealed the moment off from normal processing. I noted it. I filed it somewhere interior. I told no one. I didn't tell anyone for years. The story I told, when I told it, ended at the police call, the bus, the drive home, the part where things resolved. What I couldn't say to the school counselor, what I've only said to a small number of people since, is the thing about the bus window, the fact that I saw him there, watching, patient, still. His face turned toward the glass with a quality of attention that, in memory, seems more focused than alarmed. Watching the buses leave as though doing a final accounting. I've thought about what that posture communicates, about a person who, when confronted with the failure of a plan, police being called every adult on the property mobilized, buses loading, chooses not to run further than the nearest cover, who stays at the edge of the scene and watches it conclude. There are several explanations for that behavior, and none of them are reassuring. I think about the folding chairs in that hallway, the particular efficiency with which he used the emergency exit, the practiced steadiness in his voice when he offered to take me back to my group, not nervous, not hurried, not improvising. I think about the child-shaped gap in that situation, a kid who had a documented, well-known pattern of drifting away from groups, alone in a back corridor of a large building in a semi-rural location, separated from every adult who was responsible for her by 2 closed doors and the thickness of a converted dairy barn's walls. Those things don't happen by accident. The preparation for them doesn't happen in a single afternoon, in a single location. I hope, very sincerely, that the thing he was looking for never found him again. I hope that for the sake of every child who was in every group in every location he visited before and after that October day in Ohio. I hope it with the specific, quiet force of someone who knows exactly how thin the margin was. Whatever was standing in that room, junior year of high school, I enrolled in an elective called Unsolved Histories, offered in our school's social studies department by a teacher named Mr. Delvecchio. The class covered exactly what the name promised: unexplained events, documented disappearances, locations with incomplete historical records, and phenomena that multiple eyewitness accounts had described but that hadn't been satisfactorily accounted for. It was the kind of curriculum that could easily tip into ridiculousness, but Mr. Delvecchio ran it with enough methodological rigor to keep that from happening. He was interested in how people investigate things they don't understand, and what conclusions they draw, and where the gaps in documentation tend to cluster. The class attracted a mixture of students who were genuinely interested in the subject and students for whom any alternative to advanced placement, anything sounded like a reasonable idea. I fell into a category somewhere between the two. The semester moved through several case studies: historical disappearances with unresolved evidence, documented structures abandoned under unclear circumstances, accounts of phenomena from credible observers that existing explanatory frameworks didn't cleanly address. Mr. Delvecchio was careful not to push any particular interpretation. The point wasn't to decide what had happened. The point was to learn to look at the evidence carefully and develop hypotheses with appropriate levels of confidence. It was, in practice, a class about epistemology as much as mystery, and I found it more useful than I'd expected. My friend Caleb took the class with me. Caleb had been seriously interested in paranormal and unexplained subjects since middle school, not in a credulous, everything is a ghost way, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who found the unexplained more interesting than the explained and wanted to understand both. He had actual books about this, from actual publishers, with documented sources. He was a useful partner in the class because he brought knowledge I didn't have, and I brought skepticism he occasionally needed. And over years of friendship we'd found a productive equilibrium where neither of us fully converted the other, but both of us left conversations more nuanced than we'd entered them. Near the end of the semester, Mr. Delvecchio organized a field trip to what he described as a historically ambiguous abandoned settlement about 30 minutes from our school in the forested hills of western Maryland. He'd been bringing classes to this location for several years and had some kind of informal standing arrangement with the property owner. The visit was structured as a practical application of the investigative methods we'd spent the semester studying. We were supposed to observe the site systematically, document what we found, and try to develop well-supported hypotheses about the settlement's history and abandonment. The settlement had been built in the early 1910s. From what Mr. Delvecchio had told us over the course of the semester, it had been constructed quickly, suggesting either unusual urgency or substantial funding, and then emptied out within somewhere between 5 and 10 years of completion. The reasons were not clearly established by any existing record. Theories included a disease outbreak, the financial collapse of whoever had funded the original build, and one unverified account of some kind of catastrophic internal conflict among the residents. None of these were documented with authority. The buildings had simply been left. The forest had grown up around them. They had been standing empty for over 100 years. The bus pulled off the main road onto a narrow gravel lane that cut into dense, second-growth forest. The lane had that characteristic quality of infrastructure that was once maintained and then simply stopped being. Gravel spreading and losing definition, grass pushing through every gap, the edges blurring back into the surrounding forest floor. We went about a quarter-mile before the trees opened. I heard a student somewhere behind me on the bus exhale slowly. Nobody said anything. The settlement occupied a rough clearing of approximately 2 acres. 7 or 8 buildings stood across the space at varying angles and conditions, some listing noticeably, walls and foundations settling away from vertical in ways that shouldn't have been structurally sustainable, but had apparently persisted for decades. The construction was early 20th century institutional, brick, functional, built with the unglamorous permanence of things that weren't built to be looked at, just built to last. The mortar between bricks had been working itself loose in places. Vegetation had sent runners up the lower sections of most walls. Knee-high grass had grown through the cracked concrete between structures. But the buildings were there. And their being there had a quality, a weight, a resistance, that I'm aware sounds like the kind of thing people say to make abandoned places sound more significant than they are, but that I'm going to use anyway because it was the word that came to me then and still comes to me now. Presence. They had presence. Mr. Del Vecchio counted heads carefully, twice, before leading us forward. 23 students. We fanned out along the clearing's edge, following the rough perimeter, applying what we'd learned. Observe systematically. Note structural features. Consider what the layout implies about the community's size, organization, function. Move past the emotional response and think like an investigator. I was making a reasonable effort at this, but one building kept pulling my attention off the systematic approach. It stood at the eastern edge of the clearing, noticeably taller than the others, 3 full stories against the 2-story norm of the rest, with a wider footprint and evidence of more deliberate architectural consideration. Where the other buildings were flatly functional, this one had remnants of design intent. A front facade with the ghost of an arched entrance around, decorative brickwork along the upper story's cornice, window proportions that suggested whoever commissioned it had thought about how it should look. The front entrance had been sealed with plywood, as had the ground floor windows on all sides, but the building was intact in a way the others weren't. Presence is the word I keep returning to, even from across the clearing. Caleb appeared at my shoulder. He was already looking at it. "We're going in that one," he said. "Obviously," I said. Mr. Del Vecchio had gathered the group toward a smaller building at the center of the clearing, likely a chapel or communal hall based on the foundation shape, and while his attention was forward and the rest of the group was clustering around him, Caleb and I detached from the back and crossed the clearing in the long grass, 60 yards or so. We circled the building looking for a point of entry. Front entrance, sealed solid, plywood sheets screwed into a custom-built frame. The 2 side doors, same. The back door, same. We came around the rear corner and found the excavation. Someone had dug a pit against the rear foundation wall, maybe 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, running along the base of the building. Down in the pit, A basement-level window had been knocked out entirely, leaving a rectangular opening. A short aluminum ladder had been placed in the pit, the feet resting on the bare earth. Someone had been here before us, and they'd left access. Caleb went down first. I followed. The basement was what basements in century-old institutional buildings tend to be. Concrete floor, concrete walls, low ceiling, cold in the settled and complete way of spaces that have not been warmed by any living presence for a long time. Our phones were already out, flashlights on, casting sharp circles of white light across the floor. The light caught a layer of fine dust and grit across the concrete. Old glass bottles, dark and unlabeled with age, a single spray-painted tag on the far wall, faded to near illegibility, collapsed wooden shelving or flooring material in uneven piles across the floor. Against the back wall, a staircase ascended into total darkness. Original construction, the same age as the building itself. Narrow, steep, built to last, and having lasted, but not gracefully. The wood had dried out over 100 years until it had become something close to a different material. Every step was going to announce our presence to whatever was above us. Caleb looked at me. I looked at him. We had come this far. I went first. The sound was remarkable. Not a creak, a sustained carrying complaint that resonated through the structure in a way that seemed specifically designed to reach the farthest corners. I moved slowly, testing each board with partial weight before committing to it, and it still took 90 seconds to cover 12 steps. Caleb followed. At the top, the second floor opened into a large central space. Dark. Not dim, dark in the complete absolute way that sealed buildings with no light source are dark. Not a shadow variant of daytime, but the genuine absence of light that exists in spaces that have been sealed from the outside world. Our phone lights were the only illumination, and in that darkness they felt small, their circles inadequate to the space they were trying to address. The walls were bare plaster, cracked extensively, collapsed entirely in several places to expose the lathing underneath. The floor was original wood, dry and lifted, at its seams from decades of humidity cycles, the edges of the boards raised slightly in a way that caught the light at certain angles. Several doorways led off the central space into smaller rooms on either side, partitioned areas of uncertain original function. Offices, perhaps, or sleeping quarters. We couldn't tell without looking inside them, and looking inside them meant crossing the threshold, and the light didn't reach. Caleb and I stood in the center of the second floor. "Okay," Caleb said. "I think that's—" The sound came from one of the side rooms to the left. One sharp impact, something heavy striking a hard surface. A rock dropped onto concrete, a brick separating from high mortar and falling. Not ambient, not structural settling. Something specific and discreet that happened once and stopped. In the silence that followed, the quality of the silence was different from what it had been before the sound. "We should have left. I know this." The correct response to an unexpected sound in an unsecured building in a location you are not supposed to be in is to leave the building. I know this. Caleb knows this. We have discussed it since, and we both agree on this, and we both also know that we didn't leave. We took 2 quiet steps toward the doorway. I went first. I held my phone up and pointed the light into the room. 3 men were inside. They were standing in a loose triangular arrangement, perhaps 10 feet back from the doorway. Adults. Not young. I couldn't determine ages precisely in the phone light, which was narrow and insufficient for the space, but nothing about their posture or bearing read as young. They were upright, still, and facing the doorway. Facing me. Facing the light. They did not flinch when the light hit them. they did not speak. They did not move backward or forward or to the side. They stood in the darkness of that sealed room, in the interior of a sealed floor of a sealed building in a place that had been abandoned for 100 years, in a triangular formation that seemed deliberate, and they looked at us. For a moment, a very brief moment, nobody moved. Then Caleb and I ran. Down the stairs in a manner entirely incompatible with the structural concerns that had governed our descent. Across the basement floor, up the ladder and out of the pit and across the clearing at a speed that, in any other context, would have been conspicuous. We reached the group and positioned ourselves inside it and stood there trying to slow our breathing to something that wouldn't require explanation. One of our classmates, a kid named Derek, noticed immediately. He turned around and looked at us and said, very directly, "What happened to you two?" We told him in low voices, out of Mr. Delvecchio's range. The short version: we'd gotten into the building, gone to the second floor, found 3 men standing in one of the rooms. He stared at us. Then he looked across the clearing at the tall building. Then back at us. He had questions. We answered them quietly. For the rest of the visit, Caleb and I stayed with the group. We moved when Mr. Delvecchio moved, stayed inside the cluster of 23, and divided our attention between his commentary and the tall building across the clearing. Nothing moved in its visible windows. It stood exactly as it had before, sealed, present, giving nothing away. Then we were leaving. Mr. Delvecchio gathered everyone, counted heads, began leading us back toward the lane. I was near the rear of the group, and near the clearing's edge I turned and looked back one last time. 3rd floor, near the far corner. One window where the boards hadn't fully sealed the frame, a gap of several inches, the glass still intact behind it. In that gap, in the dimness on the other side of the glass, a pale shape. I held my gaze on it long enough for my brain to resolve the information. A face, still, looking out, watching the group walk away with the same quality of stillness that the 3 men inside had shown, not alarmed, not retreating, not surprised, simply watching. I turned around and walked to the bus. On the ride back, Caleb and I sat in the last row and spoke in voices that were quieter than they needed to be given the ambient noise of the bus. I offered the pragmatic explanations: squatters, trespassers, people who'd found their way into the only structurally intact building on the property and were using it for shelter. None of these required anything other than ordinary human beings with ordinary human reasons for being somewhere they shouldn't. Caleb listened to all of them without interrupting. Then he said, "The dust." He waited a moment. "Our footprints were the only marks in it. We walked across the whole basement floor and up the stairs and across the 2nd floor, and every step showed up in the dust, and there were no other marks. Not on the stairs, not in the central space, not near that doorway." He paused. "If those 3 men came up those stairs, any time recently, any time in the past few weeks, there would be wear in the dust. There wasn't." I sat with that. "And we both know how loud those stairs were," he continued. "We couldn't have missed anyone coming up after us. Which means if they used those stairs at all, they used them before we came down into the basement." "So they were already up there when we arrived," I said. "Standing in the dark," he said. "In that room, in that formation, waiting." The Maryland hills flattened into the familiar landscape outside our town, and the bus moved forward into ordinary evening. "I think they've been there for a long time," Caleb said. "I've carried that image for years. The 3 men standing in their triangle in the dark, motionless, unsurprised, facing the door, not startled by our arrival, not retreating from our light. just standing there in the sealed interior of a sealed building in an abandoned settlement in the woods, as if the arrival of two teenagers with phone flashlights was simply the latest in a long series of things they had waited out. I've thought about going back. The rational part of my mind insists there's an ordinary explanation and that going back in daylight with the right preparation would surface it. People use abandoned buildings, people shelter in structurally sound spaces, people find ways in and out that leave different traces than the ones we were tracking with a flashlight. But then I come back to Caleb's question about the dust, and I come back to the face at the window on the third floor, positioned where no one who'd climbed those stairs in the last hour could reasonably have been. And I think about the formation, the triangle, the way they were facing the door as if they'd known something was coming. I've shared this story with a number of people over the years, and the responses tend to cluster around two poles. The first group offers the squatter theory and feels resolved by it. The second group, which tends to include people who have spent time in abandoned buildings or who have experience with that particular kind of location, goes quiet. The silence from the second group is the one I find more telling. There's something specific about the quality of the encounter that the squatter theory doesn't fully account for, and it's this. People who shelter in abandoned buildings are, almost universally, extremely alert to the sound of other people entering. They've typically been in situations before where discovery led to confrontation, or to being forced out, or to police involvement. They do not, as a general rule, stand perfectly still in a dark interior room and wait for whoever has entered the building to find them. They listen, they assess, they calculate exit options. What they don't do is stand in a triangle formation in complete darkness facing a doorway and wait. That waiting quality. That's the thing. I've described the moment to Caleb many times, and we've worked it over from every angle we have access to. 3 adults in a sealed building, in a room on the second floor, in the dark, standing in a triangle facing the doorway. When the light hit them, they didn't flinch. They didn't speak. They didn't cover their eyes or turn away or step backward. They stood and they looked at us and they let us run. What if they were waiting for us specifically? Caleb asked once, late at night, several months after the trip. I said that was impossible. We hadn't decided to enter the building until we were standing in front of it. Nobody knew we were going to go down that ladder. Right, he said, but what if it wasn't us specifically? What if they were just waiting for whoever came? I've left it there, in the dark, in the hills of western Maryland, behind boards that don't quite cover the frames. There's a version of me that drives back out there one day and finds the building and goes down the ladder and up the stairs in full daylight with a proper flashlight and finds a perfectly ordinary explanation. Sleeping bags, food wrappers, graffiti on the walls, evidence of regular human occupation. The version of me that closes the loop. But I've been intending to make that drive for several years now, and I haven't made it yet. And every time I get close to deciding to go, I think about the face at the third-floor window, patient, watching the group walk away. And then I think about Caleb's other question, the one he asked on the bus and never repeated. If they used those stairs at all, they used them before we came down into the basement. Standing in the dark, in that room, in that triangle, waiting. So plus me rooms are better left sealed.